tonight is little more than offer a introduction or an overview of the book of Daniel. And I do this with the purpose of providing you with a foundation from which to enrich your study of the book of Daniel and the Old Testament. It's important sometimes to understand a book in its context, in its entirety. So I won't be spending an awful lot of time delving into too much detail, but I want to offer a sort of a background and an introduction to this amazing book. So basically, the book of Daniel, to summarize, has 12 chapters. That's according to the Hebrew text as we have it today. Now those 12 chapters, you could divide them a couple of ways. You could split it in half. You could say chapters 1 to 6 are historical narrative. In other words, they're presented as historical accounts of things that happened in Babylon during the 6th century BC. And they are written in the third person. Daniel speaks of Daniel. He doesn't say, I did this or I did that. He speaks in the third person. The second section, chapters 7 to 12, are different in its content. These are very apocalyptic, sort of visionary, prophetic chapters. They deal a lot with imagery, deal a lot with sort of mystical meanings and pictures, and they are written in the first person. Daniel speaks of things that he experienced, and he writes that way. Sometimes people might have thought that that might have been a clue as to maybe multiple authorship of the book of Daniel, but really that is unnecessary to arrive at that conclusion. Writing in the first and third person was common in the ancient world, particularly for writers very skilled in literature. There's examples. Julius Caesar wrote both in first and third person. Even if you look at the Apostle John, it's interesting. In his gospel account, which is historical narrative, he writes in the third person. Yet in the book of Revelation, which is apocalyptic, visionary, he writes in the first person. Similar to the way the book of Daniel is structured. Narrative in third person, apocalyptic vision in the first person. I think a more important distinction or division to look at the book of Daniel is not so much in the genre, but in the language. The book of Daniel is odd in that it is written in two languages. It's written in Aramaic and in Hebrew. I've broken it down for us here. Chapter 1 and chapters 8 through 12 are written in Hebrew, and chapters 2 to 7 are written in Aramaic. That shouldn't be unusual, considering Daniel was Jewish, but he was educated in the language and culture and literature of the Babylonians. And Aramaic was the diplomatic language of the Babylonian and Persian courts, much the same way that Greek was used in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, even though the countries that incorporated that part of the Eastern Roman Empire had their own native languages, but the Romans would have spoken Greek in that part, even in Palestine. The same with Aramaic in the Babylonian Empire. This was the standard diplomatic language. When you look at the chronology of the book of Daniel, the 12 chapters don't run sequentially or sort of straight through. That's again it's maybe odd for us to think that way of a book written, but for ancient literature that's not at all strange. Even if you look at the Gospels, much of the time, especially with John, he's not organizing his material in a strict chronology, but he's picking themes and events in a sequence that has a theological meaning. That's exactly what Daniel does in his book, and it's very interesting when you look at why he does structure his book this way. Daniel was a very highly educated and skillful writer. Chapters 1 through 6 do follow a chronology of one after another, but when you get to chapter 7, you actually move back into the period around chapter 4. And chapters 7 and 8 follow the period between chapters 4 and 5. And the last 3 chapters really follow on from chapter 6. And so it sort of doubles back on itself, strangely enough. And the reason for Daniel doing that is, I think, very interesting. He's organizing his book thematically in order to sort of weave it together in a very tight sort of parallelism. What does that mean? I'll explain basically what the chapters are about, and then I'll show you how that all fits together to make a very interesting picture. Basically, chapter 1 records the exile of Daniel to Babylon. I'll explain what that was about. Chapter 2 speaks of Nebuchadnezzar's vision, in which he is distressed and requests for sort of an interpretation of that. Chapter 3 deals with the persecution of 3 of the Hebrew exiles that accompanied Daniel. Chapter 4 is a testimony of Nebuchadnezzar. A very interesting chapter, almost unique in the entire Bible. It's written by a Babylonian. Chapter 5 is the famous writing on the wall. Chapter 6, the lion's den. Chapter 7, the Son of Man and Ancient of Days prophecy. Very significant in understanding Christ's own concept of his messianic or Christological nature. Chapter 7 is very important for that. Chapter 8 is a very strange vision of the ram and the goat. Chapter 9 is probably the most provocative and extraordinary chapter in the entire Bible, I would say. It's a chapter that is highly controversial and startling when you begin to understand its implications. Chapter 10 deals with spiritual warfare on a very sort of weird scale, Prince of Persia and his resistance to angels sent by God. Chapter 11 deals with the kings of the north and the south. Basically, chapter 11 is incredibly detailed prophetic account of the wars that would be fought in the future between 2 dynasties, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Bearing in mind that Daniel was written in the 6th century BC. These prophecies are so accurate that people have attempted to say that the book of Daniel was written after the event. But that would be impossible for a number of reasons, linguistically, textually, historically, culturally. It's impossible for Daniel to be written in any other period besides the Neo-Babylonian. And chapter 12, the finale, deals with a period of tribulation. That's a rough synopsis of the 12 chapters in the book of Daniel. Like I said, they don't follow a strict chronology. By the time you get to chapter 7, you move back into the story. The reason why is a common motif or style of writing in the ancient world that we mightn't be overly familiar with, and that is especially seen in Hebrew writing. Good literature or good poetry to Western mind is more to do with the sound, the lyrical quality. Yeah, we look at things like rhyme or alliteration, assonance, these things. In a Semitic or Hebrew mind, the beauty or the skillfulness of a work of literature is in the structure. This is something you see time and time again in the Proverbs, in the Psalms. It's something that we maybe overlook when we study the New Testament, but bearing in mind that Paul was a Pharisee immersed in Hebraic literature and understanding. Even if you look at Galatians, Ephesians, these books are structured in a way that is very important